Welcome to the Achtung History Podcast, produced by the Berlin Tour Guide and presented by Simon J. James. This week, Wernher von Braun, the Nazi who put man on the moon. It was to be a gift. It was to honor 3 years since the ascendance to the throne of the man who had been crowned prince for just 99 days. 3 years since he, the new king and Kaiser, had toured the Ottoman Empire in a visit arranged by Thomas Cook as part of a peace tour. It, a magnificent fountain, was to be placed upon the Schlossplatz, a location that palace architect Andreas Schlüter had decreed it to be the navel of Berlin, the center of the city, and the beginning of the Prussian Mile. Later upon this mark, the mark of the center of Germany, and if Karl Marx were to be believed, the world, the great architect of Berlin, Karl Friedrich Schinkel, had suggested a fountain might be erected. The man who took up this mantle was Max von Forckenbeck, Mayor of Berlin. Von Forckenbeck had spent much of his life in politics, from being a member of the First Congress of German Economists to founding the Economy Society for East and West Prussia. He had a head for economy and for avoiding conflict. His liberal mindset in a time of intense conservatism led him to being elected to the Prussian Chamber of Deputies in 1859. Through careful political maneuvering, he managed to avoid conflict with the man who would become known as the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, during the Prussian constitutional crisis of 1862 to 1866. He placed his hopes of resolving conflict in communication, and through such communication, respect for himself and his policies rose. By the end of the crisis, he was president of the Prussian House of Representatives and was elevated to the president of the German Reichstag in 1874, whilst holding the position of mayor of Breslau in Lower Silesia. Von Forckenbeck, however, knew total dedication to perform a job well, rather than perform two roles satisfactorily. It was in this mindset that, upon becoming mayor of Berlin in 1879, he resigned his position as president of the Reichstag to focus solely upon the city. Berlin needed the focus. Its narrow streets and decaying public infrastructure was leading to health problems. In the Scheunenviertel and the Vorstadt Spandau, tuberculosis was rampant. Water and sewage treatment was struggling to cope. Education was also an issue. Despite high levels of education, the school buildings themselves were decaying, and few and far between for a city growing at lightning pace. Von Forckenbeck mustered all of his energy to mount a charge of reform. New parks were opened, the most famous of which is the glorious Victoria Park in Kreuzberg. Schools of grand scale and full of light were constructed. Hospitals that were collections of small villas were opened, spaces that induced senses of relaxation that aided in healing. Schools and homes for orphans rose from the sands of Berlin. Much of such construction was done in collaboration with Hermann Blankenstein, another of Berlin's great architects. Von Forckenbeck privatized some of the urban centers, leading to private companies building the infrastructure that lit the streets, for example. Through careful consideration, liberal ideas, economic policies, von Forckenbeck oversaw a city take up the mantle of capital not just of a kingdom, but of an empire. A capital that was built on reform, symbolism, and built for its people. However, if there was one person notorious for conflict that conversation could not stifle, it was the man who sat on high. The King of Prussia and Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, now sat upon the 99-day throne of his liberal-leaning father for 3 years. Whilst Wilhelm was a passionate reformist in many of the areas in which von Forckenbeck was reforming, in schools, science, and medicine, there were few who were able to avoid being drawn into conflict with the Kaiser. Even the great Iron Chancellor, a great ego himself, keen to have his own way, had fallen. Bismarck threatened often to walk out, to which the Kaiser, with the thought of the nation being without the powerful rudder that Bismarck represented, would beg for his return and bend to the whims of the Chancellor. But in 1890, he did not ask for Bismarck to turn around and return as the Chancellor strode from the Stadtschloss in Berlin. Von Forckenbeck had posed to the Kaiser an offer of a statue upon the Schlossplatz, the plaza before Portal 2 of the great city palace that has risen once again in Berlin, a plaza that belonged not to the King and Kaiser but to the city before. Von Forckenbeck had offered a statue as a gift to reduce tensions with His Imperial Majesty, but His Imperial Majesty, spiteful and full of his elevated self-importance, had refused. In 1890, the year in which the parting of ways between Kaiser and Chancellor took place, von Forckenbeck was standing for re-election. Christopher Clark writes, Wilhelm attempted high-handed interventions in the sphere of civil society. In July 1890, he refused point-blank to ratify the election of the left liberal Max von Forckenbeck as mayor of Berlin because Forckenbeck had voted against increasing military expenditure in the Reichstag. But the ministers insisted unanimously on Forckenbeck's ratification, and Wilhelm was forced to back down. In September, Prince Philipp Fürst zu Eulenburg, the Kaiser's closest confidant, persuaded the bitter emperor to accept von Forckenbeck to continue as mayor of Berlin. Yet the seeds were sown for an eventual continuation of the showdown. Ever wishing to avoid and solve confrontation, but having to appease a man whose whims changed with the tides and often struck against them, von Forckenbeck continued with a strategy of appeasing the Kaiser. He was determined that a fountain and statue would achieve a goal of appeasement, and in order for the Kaiser to fall for his ploy, he had to play to the two most prominent traits that the young monarch had, lust and vanity. Wilhelm II had many passion projects. His greatest, eventually, would be the Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial Navy. Another was that combined vanity and lust was his constant need, despite the great deeds of his ancestors in reforming not only Prussian, but European society, and laying the foundations for institutions that have encouraged some of the greatest minds in history to cement his family legacy in iconography and stone. When wishing for a sculpture to capture in stone his desires, Wilhelm had only one man in mind, the Christian Daniel Rauch-trained Reinhold Begas. It was Begas who had created the cenotaph for Wilhelm's deceased father. It was Begas who had created the statues of Borussia and Kriegswissenschaft for the Ruhmeshalle, the exhibition that honored Prussia and its rulers, the Haus Hohenzollern. So it was Begas that Forckenbeck approached to design a statue that the emperor would accept, and the healing between city and Kaiser could begin. That was the plan. Over a year passed from the controversy of the re-election of Forckenbeck. 500,000 gold marks had been spent by the city, a figure equal to 3 million euros by today's standards. So it was on the 1st of November 1891 that the unveiling upon Schlossplatz was to take place, with the Lord Mayor von Forckenbeck and Kaiser both present. When the day came, Kaiser Wilhelm was at his home, not in Berlin, but in the imperial folly that was Potsdam and the Neue Palais, its most grandest of palaces. The previous night, Her Imperial Highness had returned from Gera in Thuringia, and in the morning she and her husband, the Kaiser, rode in carriages from the Neue Palais through the gardens of Sanssouci, below the personal and quaint palace of Friedrich the Grosse, and to the Perseus-designed Italian, medieval-inspired Friedenskirche for a service. With the service drawn to a close, the monarchs returned by carriage to the Neue Palais to breakfast. It was not a lonely breakfast, however. Invited was Wilhelm's brother-in-law, Bernhard, hereditary prince of Saxe-Meiningen, the husband of Charlotte, sister of the Kaiser, and Gustav, Crown Prince of Sweden, who himself was married to Victoria, a niece of Wilhelm's father and his own cousin. They were joined by General Lieutenant Count von Schlieffen, recently promoted to Chief of General Staff, and famous for the military plan that bore his name. In Berlin, a carriage was dispatched at 12:30 from the Marstall on Breiterstrasse for the Potsdamer Bahnhof at Potsdamer Platz, to which the Kaiser was expected to arrive. Meanwhile, as the carriage was pulled along by the royal horses, disappearing towards Spittelmarkt, the great names of Berlin governance began to arrive in preparation for the unveiling of the city's gift to the Kaiser, all not knowing how the Kaiser would react. With breakfast over, the Kaiser departed to choose the uniform that he would be dressed in for this showing of the city's respect upon to him. At 2, he was ready, dressed in the uniform of the Garde du Corps, with a paletot overcoat above, a favourite of the Kaiser, and followed by Crown Prince of Sweden Gustav in the uniform of a dragoon, they departed the Neupalais for the Wildpark Bahnhof, whence a train scheduled for departure at 2:15 awaited the monarch and his entourage. In Berlin, the guests were arriving. Travelling by carriage, they arrived from Unter den Linden and Kaiser Wilhelm Strasse onto the Lustgarten, where they were directed through portal number 4 of the Schloss and through the great courtyard, exiting once again on the opposing side via portal 2, as Breiterstrasse, that led away before them, had been cleared by the police and designated a festival site. The police, instructed by their chief Bernhard von Richthofen, had begun to clear the area of all those not wished to be present, or rather were not invited at the moment that the Kaiser's train had departed from the station in Potsdam. When 3 o'clock came around, the crowd started to become agitated. It was known that it was little more than 45 minutes from the Wildpark Bahnhof to Potsdamer Platz, and, knowing the Kaiser's temperament, the jitters started to spread. The seats were almost full. The press was also present, but as Reinhold Begas, his brother and fellow sculptors Karl Begas, Bergmayer, Kutz, and Bernowitz took their seats, the other officials scurried to the front portal for the arrival of the Kaiser. 5 guards were stationed in the space behind portal 1, as Mayor von Forckenbeck, Stadtrat Otto Schreier, the syndic Robert Zeller, city building councillor James Holbrecht, who would heavily influence Berlin's cityscape, and councillors Dr. Langerhans, Siebmann, Seibert, Garrick, Spinola, Nicolai, Bernhardt, and Reiss. It was the cheers that alerted them to the arrival of the Kaiser. Just before the clocks of the church towers across the city struck 3, a great hurrah emanated from the direction of Schinkel's Schlossbrücke, as the carriage drawing the Kaiser approached. Those gathered behind the great gates of the portal, including the 5 guard corps, all stiffened, the corps into attention, the city officials into indoctrinated discipline. Behind, they waited. Only their ears could play out the scene before the door of the arrival of the Kaiser's carriage, his stepping from within, followed by their imaginations playing out the sounds of his footsteps as he approached the gates. 5 minutes past 3, and the great portal gates swung open, and through, dressed in the uniform of the Garde du Corps, was His Imperial Majesty. Striding boldly forward into the courtyard of the Schloss, his left hand gripping the hilt of his sword that swung from his waist, his right swinging at his side. Behind came the Crown Prince of Sweden, Hereditary Prince of Saxe-Meiningen, and the entirety of the Imperial headquarters. Striding forwards, the Kaiser's gaze was fixed upon Lord Mayor von Forckenbeck. As he approached, the Kaiser held out his right hand and came to a short, sharp halt before the aging Lord Mayor. Forckenbeck took the Kaiser's hand in his own and gave a curt Prussian bow. Shaking the Lord Mayor's hand, the Kaiser spoke.
"Congratulations, Herr Oberbürgermeister, in retrospect to your 70th birthday, and I am glad you look so fresh and chipper."
In response, von Forckenbeck replied,
"Thank you, Your Eternal Majesty, but alas, my health leaves little to be desired."
Together, the Lord Mayor and the Kaiser walked through the courtyards of the Schloss before they turned towards Portal 2, which opened onto the Breiterstrasse, one of Berlin's most beautiful and historical, and where the crowds had gathered and the new statue stood under wraps awaiting the Kaiser. The cheers began once again as they approached. Many of those who had been offered a seat rose to catch a glimpse of the Emperor. The Emperor and his entourage lined up before the entrance to the Breitestrasse, and Mayor von Forckenbeck stepped forward to deliver an address to the Kaiser in the presence of the city representatives, artists, and press.
Most high and mighty Emperor, most gracious Emperor, King, and Lord. 3 years ago, when your eternal imperial and royal majesty returned home from a peace procession through the world, the eternal majesty designed to permit that the city of Berlin, in deep, grateful homage, place here in front of the royal palace a monumental fountain in ore and stone, designed by a Berlin master whom we proudly call our fellow citizen. Since then, artists and craftsmen have relentlessly completed this fountain and installed it in connection with the municipal waterworks.
Obviously, von Forckenbeck was playing to the Kaiser's ego and using his own powers of oratory to wipe away the bickering years of past with a redesigned narrative that would appease his eternal majesty.
Allow me, eternal majesty,
von Forckenbeck continued,
that the fountain, now a permanent sign of the capital's deep gratitude and its unwavering loyalty and devotion for your eternal majesty, be revealed.
Before the casings around the fountain were allowed to fall, the Kaiser himself stepped forward, bowed with thanks towards von Forckenbeck, and spoke.
I am pleased. It is once again one of the works that have been created under the long-lasting effectiveness that you have so successfully pursued in your position as Lord Mayor of Berlin. It is a landmark in the development of the city, and I, as a born Berliner, am particularly grateful to you for having given the city a new jewel with this fountain. I hope that you will be able to extend this residence within its boundaries and expand its interior for quite some time to come.
The Kaiser waved his hand in a motion to reveal the fountain from its casings, and von Forckenbeck led the crowd in an enthusiastic triple hurrah for His Majesty. The casings fell away, and after a momentary pause, the waters of the fountain sprung into life and revealed to all gathered the masterpiece that Begas had created. From a pipe running beneath the Kurfürstenbrücke, where the great elector sat upon his horse, and running towards Breitestrasse, the water flowed. A 40-centimeter diameter pipe that on reaching the fountain narrowed at 20, and at which point it branched off and divided into 24 individual parts to feed the waterspouts that now dosed the cast figures in the waters of Berlin. With the statue revealed, the original fears that the great facade of the palace would dwarf any fountain or statue below were quashed. Rising from an elliptical basin, a cascade of overlapping rocks jut forth and up. From these boulders, 4 mighty sea centaurs rear, their front webbed hoofs reaching out, their hands supporting the great shell from over the edges of which the water rushes over. The power and the majesty of the mythical creatures reminiscent of Bucklin's great paintings of creatures and man. Each is its own, not simply copies replicated. One reaches forward and prods and never glares forward with great fish eyes. One shows flowing long locks of hair, and another their hair is in strands plastered, as if by the very water that flows over it, to the forehead. Sea objects and creatures decorate the sea centaurs, seaweed, shells, starfish, ropes, and nets. Upon the rocks climbs a lobster. A cherub looks on fearful as the lobster approaches. 2 more cherubs attempt to climb up onto the shell above where the companions play with urns from which water eternally falls. Above all, however, is the Lord and God of the sea, Neptune. He does not stretch his iconic trident forward as if caught in the midst of battle, but rather raises it high, as if victorious in battle. He has come to rest upon the shell triumphantly, one leg still in the depths, the other on the surface. He, Neptune, displays his long beard and muscular body, and a head crowned with reeds. At his base, surrounding the clover leaf basin, sit 4 females. They laze casually upon the basin's edge. Here these ladies come to represent the 4 major rivers of the Kaiserreich. The Lady of the Vistula, with wooden blocks of the forests. The Oder carries hide. Elbe has ears of corn and fruit, and the great Rhine with fishnets and grapes. In the waters of the fountain lay an inner ring, a ring of salient animals emerging from the flood that had swarmed them. The crocodile, the seal, snake, and turtle, embodying Silesia. His counterpart, goddess of the leaping spring, who, from each of the 4 components, shower upon Neptune their fealty as lord of the sea. The Kaiser expressed an audible "ah" as he gazed upon the waters, leaping over the shimmering metal cast by Menzel from Begis's forms. Aware of the wit of the Berliner, being one himself, the Kaiser quickly exclaimed to the Lord Mayor,
"We want to give the fountain a name, because my esteemed gentlemen from Berlin are a bit malicious and like to make jokes. I think we should give it a new name, Schlossbrunnen."
To this, Mayor von Forckenbeck returned,
"I think that the administration and the people of Berlin will find this quite desirable. It shall be."
Wilhelm nodded and turned to Reinhold Begas, the 60-year-old sculptor, whose face was predominantly obscured by a long flowing beard of curls, and spoke.
"I cannot tell you to rest on your laurels, for I would deprive you of your art. But I would not advise you to rest on this fountain. It might get a bit cold."
The Emperor smiled toward his favorite sculptor, who graciously accepted the Kaiser's compliments. Wilhelm wandered closer to the fountain and slowly traversed its edge, taking in the constituent parts of the fountain that now dominated the square in front of the palace, and was in no means lost to the facade of the Schloss. One complemented the other. The Schlossbrunnen and Neptune triumphantly crowned one of Berlin's most beautiful streets, the Breite Strasse. For a short while after admiring Begis's triumph, the Kaiser milled around with the elected administrators of the city. Discussions on the city and the Kaiser expressed his interest in the day-to-day affairs, but he also had a different agenda. The Schlossbrunnen was a redesign of the Schlossplatz, but the Kaiser wished for a further redesign of the area before the main portal, where for over 200 years the houses of the courtiers, the businesses and cafes like Café Josti stood, the Schloss Freiheit. It was an area he hoped the city would agree could be cleared of the buildings that obscured the palace. Yet it was also a hope to allow for space for the new Kaiser Wilhelm to honor his grandfather, the old Wilhelm, the first emperor of the new Kaiserreich. They were just tentative feelers that Wilhelm was laying before the members of the administration, and by 4 o'clock the Kaiser had decided to return to the Schloss. The city administration, artists and press cleared, and von Richthofen allowed his police to reopen the square to the public. Quickly the public swarmed the square where the Kaiser had just been, hoping to catch some of the air in which the emperor had walked and bask in the atmosphere of the recent unveiling of the statue. Thousands descended upon the Schlossplatz to admire the Schlossbrunnen. Eyes were wide with admiration for the water that played in the evening light of November. Even the following day, the Monday, crowds continued to flock to see the new work of Majesty. However, if the Kaiser had hoped his proclamation of the Schlossbrunnen would quell the often bitter humor of the Berliner, he was certainly mistaken. Quickly amongst the crowds, jokes started to circle. "It's the Fork und Becher Brunnen" was an early one, a play on the fork of Neptune and the beaker that the water was held within, sounding similar to the name of the mayor, Forckenbeck. Pointing at the woman of the river sitting upon the edge to keep the edge was Berlinerish for keeping one's mouth shut, so quickly the joke ran,
Begas hast ihn Wahrheit Wunder vollbracht, hast die ersten Berlinerinnen geschaffen, die den Rand halten.
or
Begas has performed a miracle. He's created the first Berlin woman to keep the edge.
such was the humor that the Kaiser himself had warned over of the Berliner. It seemed, however, that all was well. The Kaiser was delighted with the work of Begas. Begas was basking in the praise of his Imperial Majesty. Von Forckenbeck had delivered a gift, rewritten his history with the Kaiser, and quelled confrontation, even if, in total, it had cost 500,000 marks. Yet, if Begas could not rest upon his laurels, neither could Forckenbeck, for he should have known better to think the Kaiser's mood would last. The unveiling of the statue heralded not only the redesign of the Schlossplatz, but also the arrival of the Kaiser to Berlin for the winter months. His typical residence, Potsdam's Neupalais, grand and bombastic, built to impress, was a summer residence. By the winters of the north that can turn harsh and bite, its great halls and chambers, caverns and reception rooms were perfect when the summer rays danced through the long windows, but by winter the air within grew frosty. The Kaiser had begun a modernization period upon the death of his father within the palace to bring such modern technologies like steam heating to its rooms, but it was not ready for use yet. So, for the winter months, the Kaiser returned to tradition and took up occupancy of the Berlin Schloss. From his bedroom, decked in rich cut velvet hangings trimmed with gold, the Kaiser could see the crowds play upon the fountain he had just opened. Even though the winter winds were beginning to chill, children frolicked amongst the cherubs that poured water over each other, or ran from the sea monster that rose from the basin. Here the Kaiser stood, staring out, and Neptune stared back. The city government, however, was at this point not as pleased. The children who played within the waters were vandals, and the statue was lucky, according to them, not to have received any damage. The women sitting silently on the edge had been defaced with the scribblings of the, as they described, Janhagel, a North German and Dutch outdated expression for the mob. Thinking of the monument and the mob, the Berlin Council began touting the idea that a protective fence might be erected to save the fountain from the grimy hands of the people. The artist, Begas, however, came to the aid of the children, encouraging the touching of the monument, for it encourages a patina to form, and arguing a fence would detract from the natural form that the fountain takes in rising from the ground. A solution was proposed by one newspaper to surround the basin with a lawn with flower beds, to which the Berlin Tageblatt wrote,
which the public obviously would not enter.
A defense that might have worked then, but clearly would not deter the influencer Instagrammer plague of today, where little is held sacred from their destruction. In the end, the Kaiser himself was firmly opposed to any restriction being placed on the fountain that might hinder the access of the Berliners to their new folly. In a cabinet letter, His Majesty's adjutant, Helmut von Moltke, the younger, wrote to Mayor Forckenbeck,
His Majesty, the Emperor and King, has instructed me to question your honour as to how it has come to the knowledge of His Most Highness that the magistrate intends to surround the fountain in the square of the castle with a grating in order to keep the public from coming too close to the fountain. His Majesty wishes that this project be abandoned and that the public's unhindered approach to the fountain be preserved.
Another problem arose from the goat that sat beside the embodiment of the odour. Again, according to the Berliner Tageblatt,
people have also bumped into the horn of the resting goat, which was, however, projecting far out. This is why it has been provided with a cork, just like the horns of the vicious chamois in our zoological garden, which loves to attack people from behind with its horns from its necks.
On the 1st of December, the water to the fountain was turned off, before the waters had chanced to freeze, as they often could in Berlin, bringing the flow of the Spree and the Landwehr canals to a halt. Buckets were used to extract the few remaining drops, and Neptune sat dry. A realization was made, however. The waters that had supplied the fountain had run too weak. The urns, when they were emptied, were hardly filled with water, and the solution would have to be found to increase the flow. But through the winter, the Kaiser continued with his daily work, often working alone until late within his study in the palace. Trips were arranged and visits were made. Late in the mornings, the Kaiser would rise and take breakfast after midday had already passed, and awaiting the rise of His Imperial Highness was always the gaze of the god at his window. It was in March of the next year that the famous erratic nature of the Kaiser bubbled to the surface. The 4th of March, 1892, was the 4-year anniversary of the death of the Kaiser's dearly beloved and idealized grandfather, the first Kaiser of the new German Empire, and the man that the Kaiser was hoping to honor with a grand memorial on the Schloss Freiheit that stood before the Berlin Stadtschloss. To honor this departed Kaiser, an event was to be held at the mausoleum in the grounds of Schloss Charlottenburg, where the first Kaiser Wilhelm rested with his father, King Friedrich Wilhelm III, and his mother, the eternally youthful Queen Louisa. Approaching the palace of Charlottenburg, those within the royal carriages were treated to the spectacle of the palace being awash with the light of thousands of candles lit in remembrance. Through the gates into the gardens the carriages were allowed to pass, whilst the people of Berlin and Charlottenburg who had ventured out on this bitterly cold March morn were held back by the wrought iron barriers. The first to pay their respects was Britain's Princess Royale, Victoria, known as Empress Friedrich, the wife of the departed Emperor Friedrich, and daughter-in-law to the first Kaiser, and mother to the current. Walking solemnly up the steps to the temple, like mausoleum, she was handed a wreath of laurel, which on entering the building she duly laid upon the sarcophagus of the emperor. At 9:30 arrived Prince Friedrich Leopold, who lay a cross of white roses, and at 10:30 arrived Wilhelm and his wife, Empress Augusta Victoria. Privy Councillor Meissner handed the Kaiser a cross of white roses and lilac, from which hung an atlas ribbon that bore the initials of the royal pair. The couple entered the chamber and solemnly laid the cross. The Kaiser, for a while, remained stoically silent. Stone walls, stone floor, marble sarcophagus. The room had little warmth. But still the Kaiser stayed. There were some matters of business also to prolong his stay. He called in the royal glassmaker Friedrich Pohl of Pohl and Wagner. Wilhelm was worried that the light that shone in onto the sarcophagus of his grandfather was too harsh, and had prepared Pohl to bring some samples of stained glass that might be used to diminish and diffuse the harshness of the light. Pohl showed the Kaiser some examples, and Wilhelm selected a royal purple as fitting. Finally, with that matter of business settled, the Kaiser left. On the next morn, however, as Neptune glared in, the Kaiser did not feel too well. The doctors were called in, and it was quickly decided that the Kaiser needed to rest in bed. There were signs of the symptoms of a cold, but when the Kaiser's health was in question, it was always better to show caution. A court report was prepared and released to the press. Quickly the press and the public put the Kaiser's ill health on the visit to the freezing cold mausoleum, and they were probably right. So there the Kaiser lay, rested in bed, with the watchful gaze of Neptune out of his window, always watching in. The Kaiserin had made it already clear that she wished not to stay in the Berlin Schloss longer than needed, wishing to make a return to the Neupalais by the end of the month, when there was hope that the temperature might rise once again into the positive numbers. But the Kaiser was ill, and soon the programme of entertainment that he was expected to perform had to be trimmed and cancelled, and more bed rest was ordered. One day rolled into the next, and again into the next. Breakfast was taken in bed, and the Kaiser ordered to move only as much as was necessary. When the curtains were opened in the late morning to allow new air and natural light in, it was Neptune who greeted proudly the Kaiser good morning. Neptune, who sat there strong as stone as the Kaiser, who so often had struggled in his life with feelings of weakness, predominantly due to his withered left arm, cowered with cold in bed. 9 days passed and the Kaiser still stayed in his bed. It was only on the 14th that finally he was able to take a walk from the heavy sheets that had kept him contained, and it was with news that his new racing yacht, the Meteor, which with he hoped to beat his cousin the Prince George with at the yacht race at Cowes, had been registered, that he was able to leave his bed. His health, however, was still in doubt. On the 17th he returned to work. On the 18th his doctors recommended that he leave Berlin, something the Kaiser was eager to do. It was said that with a population numbering over 1 million, the air of Berlin was unhealthy, and the palace itself, not having any form of garden, was stifling his health. However, the escape of the glare of Neptune might have been the predominant factor, and his health only secondary. To Hubertusstock he travelled, a small hunting lodge palace in the middle of the forest to Berlin's north. Whilst the Kaiser recuperated, Berlin was awash with rumours of his health. There was word of an operation having been performed by Dr. Ernesti. Reports flowed in that his voice was hoarse, his chest heavy, and often found the air to be lacking around him. His transgressing the borders of a cold, the Kaiser was now suffering a full fever. At least there was a solitude at Hubertusstock. Finally, with rest and fresh air, the Kaiser was well enough again to make a return to Berlin. On the 26th, his carriage arrived at the Eberswalde station, at which the imperial train was waiting. The train, painted in the white of linen and a Prussian blue, stood proudly out from the other rolling stock in the station, and naturally was more luxurious in the interior than others as well. In comfort, the Kaiser travelled to the Stettiner Bahnhof in Berlin and on to the royal palace. The staff, his family, distinguished guests were all awaiting him, but there was one that had not moved in the slightest since his departure: Neptune. Enough was enough. The Kaiser, in a rage of petulance, decried the positioning of the statue, his constant struggle with self-confidence being whittled down by the powerful god beyond the glass, bringing his notorious erratic nature to the forefront both within the palace and publicly. Decrying Forckenbeck and the Berlin Council, the Kaiser publicly cried that the statue should be turned, and rather than glaring upon the Kaiser, to which no man and only God was above, Neptune should be turned to look upon the great red tower of the city hall and remind the politicians of their place. Forckenbeck, however, was growing tired of the Kaiser's ranting. His own health in the recent months was failing him, and he had little patience for the ranting of the Kaiser and little energy to fight against his Imperial Highness's whims. Yet there was one satisfying point that he could not help ignore. The Kaiser did not own Schlossplatz, upon which Neptune rested. Forckenbeck ordered the city council to do as the Kaiser requested, but with one change. So in preparation for the spring that was late arriving in 1892, with the temperatures well into April barely rising past 5 degrees Celsius, the fountain was turned, whilst the Kaiser and Kaiserin held court once more from the Neue Palais in Potsdam. It would only be later that when the Kaiser visited his imperial capital, and the late morning sun was let in with the throwing back of the curtains, that the Kaiser received his final gift from Max von Forckenbeck. For the statue had not been turned as he wished, to face the city council. Now rather than the glare of the eyes staring in and through the window pane, the Kaiser found himself gazing fully upon Neptune's arse. Max von Forckenbeck sadly passed away not long after, on the 26th of May, 1892. His name today is only loosely remembered with the fountain and by the naming of the Platz in his honour in Berlin's Friedrichshain in 1895. Thank you for listening to the Achtung History Podcast, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James, and produced by theberlintourguide.com. If you wish to find out more about the Achtung History Podcast, visit the website at theberlintourguide.com/Achtung History. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at Achtung History, or visit the Facebook page. If you wish to support Achtung History, you can visit the Patreon page at patreon.com/Achtung History, where you'll find our new episode notes podcast, an informal chat into history. This has been Kaiser Against God.